Okay, so you guys are gonna have to forgive me. I'm like woefully unprepared, so my slides are really bad. And there's not a huge amount of content, so hopefully we'll have time for the roundtable. My name's Donald. I work at a company called Vertical City. It used to be called Visio, if you heard of us. We put screens into elevators that play ads. So if you've ever seen those, you're welcome. That could be us. And we're going to talk about JS testing today. So we'll talk about some testing concepts. So this will be maybe new stuff to some of the newer people, but for a lot of us, it's just a refresher. And then we'll talk a bit about Minitest and R-Spec, which are, of course, the big two kind of Ruby testing frameworks. And then we'll talk about some JS frameworks, and then we'll compare how they kind of solve different problems that come up when you're trying to test things. So just a quick show of hands. I'm just curious. Who here is like team Minitest hardcore? If you don't test your Ruby, you should, but it's okay. Minitest?
I would like to use Minitest, but every project I've been on, they always use R-Spec. Because they really like to play the block.
Okay, and who's team R-Spec? I happen to be on team R-Spec. Okay, cool. So a few more people using R-Spec than Minitest. And who's testing their JavaScript? Especially, I'm curious for Rails apps. If you're writing Rails apps, are you testing your JavaScript? I like to. Yeah? Okay, actually most people are. That's good. Okay, cool. So testing concepts. So there's kind of different levels of tests. So as we're writing code, we have unit tests that are those like super low level. You're checking what the return value is on like a single method on a single class without any interaction outside of it. That's called a unit test. Integration tests are things where our class is maybe talking to another class. Maybe in the Rails world, you have a controller that's talking to a model, saving a model, doing some stuff there. So that would be an integration test. So it's kind of a higher level. You're testing a bigger portion of your app. And then finally, this last one, this usually turns into a huge debate because people call them all kinds of different things and they define them differently. I think the naming actually probably depends on what your app is and how you want to test it. But you could call it a functional test, a feature, system, end-to-end, or acceptance tests. People might debate and say acceptance test is when a user is actually testing it or whatever. But the premise of it is you're testing your whole app. So this is the kind of thing where if a unit test is checking that you're calculating tax correctly, an integration test is that when you create an invoice, your whole thing is working and you're getting the tax correct with the whole system. And then with the whole kind of invoice system. And then the end-to-end or acceptance test would be like running your whole app and clicking through the actual browser and seeing that the user actually gets back the correct invoice. So it's testing every single component. Yeah, so thank you all for not fighting with me on the last one. Call them whatever you want. I'll probably call them acceptance tests today. That's what I mean when I say that word. Phases, so this is really important. So this is on the level of an individual test. We have a bunch of things that we want to do. So the first thing is we want to actually set up our test. So in most cases, this is just instantiating a model. So if you have an invoice class, it's new invoice. That's my setup. Then I want to exercise my test. That usually comes down to just calling a method or a function or something like that. So in this example, we have just do your job is the method. Then we want to verify. This is the important part of the test that either passes or fails, and this lets us know if our code is broken or if we have stuff left to do if we're doing TDD. So this is just, we expect that the job is done or that the response is correct, whatever. And the last part is teardown. This one we can often forget about because it's usually handled for us. So most testing frameworks, Minitest, R-Spec, they'll clean up after your test. You don't have to think about it. You don't have to like create your invoice, then destroy it or reallocate the memory or something. It just happens for you most of the time, which is great. The important part about this one, teardown is really important for keeping your tests kind of pure. So imagine we're writing a report test and my report wants to tell me the total sum value of a bunch of invoices. So I expect 3 invoices of $300. I should get $900 back in my report. If I have another test that's creating an invoice and I'm not tearing that down properly, that's going to break my report test if it comes afterwards. And it's also going to introduce this dependency between my tests where the order matters. And that's something we want to avoid as much as possible. So this is something to be really aware of, is making sure that you understand how your different tools are tearing things down. And if you have to do it manually, that you are doing that properly. Cool. The importance of JS testing. I don't have any notes for this, but I just want to talk about this for a minute, because I think it's funny that with Rails, there are people who don't test their JavaScript. And I think that it comes from probably 5 years ago, 6 years ago. The web wasn't as interactive as it is now. So we didn't have as much, like slide in a new page over top of another one and crazy like pop-ups that, render things, whatever. The web was very much like, I click a button, I get taken to a new page, and it's a different page. Maybe you had some JavaScript for like one pop-up or modal just to confirm that you want to do what you said. But more and more, as we've like React has come out, and we have Ember, we have Vue.js, we have all these like really fancy frameworks, the web is getting really, really advanced, and a lot of our logic is existing on that client side. So I think a lot of us still have, I definitely do, have bad habits around what we used to do when the web wasn't as interactive and what we used to test, which was just the back end. So I think it's become more and more important to test our JS as our JS has gotten more complicated, more of our logic lives in it if we're writing a web app. The other thing that I think has really changed in this regard is we have more JavaScript appearing on the back end. So we have things like Node that are making things, for one, very testable. The back end is always going to be easier to test than your front end. I think not only has JS testing become more important, but it's become easier, I think, as a result, which is really great. Cool. So test your JavaScript. That's the point. Okay, mini test. So this is a really simple example of mini test. They have two separate syntaxes. This one is called the test syntax. You can see here we have that setup phase that we talked about, and it's really straightforward. They call it setup, so you know what it's doing. You can see here we have our exercise step, which is calling ICANN has cheeseburger. This is from their docs. They're this funny. I'm not. And then we have our expectation. What is that step called? Or verification, sorry, or verify step, where we assert that the response is equal to what we expect. One thing they're doing here that I really like is you have a separation between your exercising and your verification. So there's a space in between, so you can tell, like, this is doing all this stuff, and then this is my actual test to make sure that it worked. So that's the test syntax. They have another syntax, which is called a Spec Syntax. So this one is designed to be a little more readable and a little more human language, less computer language. So we have, before we run our tests, instead of saying setup as we did here, we say, before we run our tests, instantiate my stuff. So this is my setup step. And then we have kind of more blocks to describe what's happening. So we have, when asked about cheeseburgers, it must respond positively. Whereas in the previous one, we just had test that kitty can eat, which is like a little harder, at least for me, to grok. As an R-Spec fan, I way, way, way prefer this. I think it makes it more clear what you're trying to accomplish by having a little more language. Although, as somebody said, you have to like typing to use this. I think that was Chris. Cool. So R-Spec looks really similar to that last one that we looked at. We have a really simple test here. One thing that I set up in this is I'm using let lazy loads whatever the code is here. So this doesn't actually get called before my it block runs. It gets called when I say resource. So this actually gets kind of replaced with what's going on here. Oops. The only other thing I'll mention really quickly is R-Spec does support a before syntax, kind of like this one. So you can set up things like before each of my tests do something, or alternatively before all of my tests do something. Yeah. Okay, JavaScript frameworks. So I picked 3. There's probably about 800. It's really frustrating working in the JavaScript world because of that, because there's like, you can just drown in all the options. I literally, a while ago, I saw a Twitter thread where 2 guys were complaining about, oh, there's too many test frameworks in JavaScript and none of them do this right. And by the end of the thread, they created a new JavaScript testing framework, which is just amazing. Yeah.
XKCD thing about that.
Yeah,
Which applies to standards as well.
Yeah. So going back to like why there's so many languages, I think it's because developers aren't good at our jobs. Excuse me. Okay, so the different frameworks I kind of chose to look at, are Jest. Jest is, I think, right now maybe the most popular. It's a bit debatable how you're going to measure that. So we have like GitHub stars in this column, and Jest has almost 30,000 right now, which is wild. And you can think of it as very close to R-Spec. R-Spec is really big and has a way built in for you to do everything. I think Jest is kind of going for the same thing, although it's not quite as mature. So it has its own built-in spies, mocks, snapshots, so it'll actually take a picture of your browser and you can compare that against a stored image. It has a code coverage tool, so it'll tell you how well you're covered. And it also has a bunch of built-in support for React. Jest is built by Facebook, much like React, so it kind of makes sense why those 2 would pair so well. But I just want to backtrack quickly because there's something I forgot to mention. One thing about Minitest is it's really close. It's pretty much just raw Ruby. That's all it is, which is, I think, why it's appealing to a lot of people. Whereas R-Spec is like this big framework that has a lot of stuff that Ruby itself doesn't have or doesn't support. So when I'm making this comparison of Jest being closer to R-Spec, it is because it is that bigger framework. It has a lot more going on. It's not raw JS you're working in. Mocha. Okay, so Mocha is a little older, I think, although I couldn't find the initial release dates online. It has 18,000, but I think it probably is growing at a slower rate than what Jest is. It's super extendable, so it kind of operates the way a lot of the JavaScript ecosystem does, where you can pull in different things that you want to use. It is a mature ecosystem, like I said, and it's super flexible because of that setup where you're extending it. It's designed to be used that way. You'll often use it with things like sign-on to give you spies, chai to give you matchers, stuff like that. And the last one is Jasmine. Jasmine is, again, a little bit older. It's the recommended one for Angular. So if you're working with the Angular, their docs, their CLI, everything's actually built to just have that all work together really nicely, which is cool. It is built to be readable, kind of like R-Spec. I think it's, again, closer on that R-Spec side, where it's a big framework, there's a lot going on, and it ships with everything out of the box. So you don't have to import all of these things for mocking, but you also lose that flexibility if you don't like how they do things. So my guess is, if you are an R-Spec fan, I think you will like Jest or Jasmine. I think if you're a Minitest fan, you will prefer Mocha. That's my guess. So if you guys end up trying these, let me know, because I'm curious if I'm right about that. So I've just chosen a handful of examples of how they do things versus the Ruby version and what those look like. But I just did Jest just to save time, and also this is a Ruby meetup, so we probably shouldn't just talk about JavaScript. Okay, so a really simple problem in tests is sharing setup. So if I want to test 50 different things on a model, I don't want to have to instantiate the model 50 times, or I don't want to have to type out instantiate my model 50 times. So in this case, I actually have the wrong name for this parent class, so forgive me. I copy and pasted and then didn't fix enough stuff. That should say meme test. So this is a really simple mini test example. We have our setup, and we have a parent class here, meme test, and then we inherit in these other ones, and then they automatically get that setup set on them, which is pretty cool. it's interesting because this is just raw Ruby. This is just Ruby inheritance. There's no, Minitest doesn't provide you a way of doing this. There's just, this is how you would do it in Ruby, so do it that way. Yeah. In the other example that we saw in Minitest where we were using the spec syntax, you could use before blocks to do this kind of stuff, which is interesting that they kind of have both sides. But I think if you were to use the spec syntax, you might as well just use R-Spec. Okay, R-Spec sharing setup. We have these blocks, describe, context. What's really cool about the R-Spec setup is you can actually do your before block right in here, within your context, and then that one set of tests will actually share all the same setup. If I had setup that was universal to all these tests, I could put it in this describe the bit thing, and that would actually share the setup across all the examples. What I like about this is it kind of, contexts naturally match up with setup. If you have a different context, you probably have a slightly different setup of your model or whatever. Yeah, cool. Jest sharing setup. So Jest uses this before kind of syntax that we saw in the specs. So you see here we're initializing a database, and then within each of these tests, we actually already have that set up for us. And again, similar to the R-Spec example, you can see we have a describe block here, and this second before each will actually only apply to everything nested underneath. So if we wanted, in this case, matching cities to foods, and we need the food database, we can set that up within just this context, and we're not polluting these examples with data that they don't need. Okay, shared examples. So this is a little bit different. What we were talking about here is just sharing the setup. Another thing you might want to do in tests is share essentially the whole test. So if I have, let's say an example would be like an invoice and a receipt, and both of them need to be able to calculate tax, and I might have a different kind of, I might have the same expectation of them that they calculate it the same way, or I would want them to do that. So I would, in that case, you don't just want the same setup. You might actually even want a different setup, but what you want is the same expectation, that same validation step, that it's behaving the same way. So I'm just going to open an external example. So with Minitest, they don't, again, they don't give this to you. It's not built into the framework, but because it's raw Ruby, you can actually write this super quickly yourself. So the example this guy used was authentication. Authentication is something that applies usually throughout your app. And you want to test that all of your controllers that are doing authentication are doing it correctly. So what this person chose to do was they have their monitors controller, their application controller where the authentication is happening, and they just built this, it requires authentication. And you can see they took the Minitest spec class, opened it, and extended it. So we all know Ruby is super easy to overwrite things. So in this case, he just opens up the Minitest spec, adds this new method, and then within each of those tests that they're doing, they can use it requires authentication, and they know immediately that this bit that's written here is getting run, and that same assertion that we had that we want across the different classes is getting run on each of them. So that's a Minitest example. Again, it's yeah, it's very much built to for you to configure your own test setup as you like it. It's not built to be prescriptive. R-Spec does have a built-in example or a built-in way of doing this, as we would expect, because it is that framework that kind of takes over everything in your test suite and does provide a way of doing everything, which is kind of cool. So in this case, we have something called a collection spec, and it applies to things like arrays, but also sets, or maybe even hashes or something. You want to make sure that if you have a shared method between those, like maybe just returning the indices of each of the elements or something, That's something that we might want in an array, but we also might want it in a hash. So let's make sure that it behaves the same in both. So in R-Spec, what you do is you set this shared example block, and then within each of your classes, you just call it behaves like a collection. And that's it. It's very simple, it's very straightforward, but it's also very R-Spec. So if you don't like having to do things their particular way, this probably doesn't appeal to you, but it is quite a bit simpler than what we saw here, where you have to be building your own classes and exporting them and all of that jazz. Yeah. Oops. So Jest shared examples actually follow the mini test pattern, which is really interesting because I think Jest is conceptually closer to R-Spec, as I've said. But I think this is something that I bet they will add in the future. But there are examples online of doing something really similar, where you just are importing a JavaScript function to run within your test. Okay, so like I said, I don't have a lot of material. I'm sorry. So this is actually my last slide. But what I want to quickly talk about is just what to test with JavaScript, because this is something I've seen people struggle with a lot and something I've done poorly in the past. The most important thing to me is that you test behavior and you're not testing just what something looks like in the case of DOM testing. So you don't want to test that a button is blue, but if you click a button and it pops up a modal, that's what you want to be testing. You want to make sure that that modal renders correctly. Anything interactive, if there's a case where your button shouldn't render, that's something you want to test. But if it's just the color of it, unless that color is changing based on user behavior or input or something, don't test that. Because what will end up happening is inevitably you'll have a designer or a client come to you and say, I want to change the color of that, and then your test suite breaks. And it's like, well, the app is working. Everything, you can still click the button and the modal pops up. You can still save things and whatever. It just looks different. So we don't want our tests to fail. What happens is you end up with a really brittle test suite that isn't actually testing any of the complicated stuff. It's just testing the dumb stuff that you can test by opening the page and looking at it. How to interact with the DOM. So this one is like really contentious. There's a problem with front-end testing where how we grab different elements to test them really impacts the effectiveness of our test suite. So let's say, for example, I want to test, Susan works at Scope, so I'm going to use Scope as an example. Whoa, cool site. Scope is looking good.
Now you can inspect it and see just how helpful it is.
Yeah. So here's an H1 as an example. That's a header tag. So you can see it's big text. So one option, if we wanted to test this, is we could just grab it based on that H1. But again, that gives us that problem where if a designer comes in and they say, that should actually be an H2. That should be a little smaller text. We want to accent the button more or something. All of a sudden, all your tests break. So there's a few ways of getting around this. One thing that I've seen people do is they'll actually add an ARIA label to it. So they'll be like, ARIA, whatever. I think I can add it here. Can I? Nope. Never mind. I'm not going to actually do it. But you could add an ARIA label. Those are used for accessibility. So there's a problem with that. If you ever want to get to the point where your app is really good for screen readers or people that can't visually interact with your app, that ARIA label thing is going to become a problem. There's actually a lawsuit in the States, I think a week ago. Somebody posted it in Dev Edmonton. But there was a site that wasn't accessible, and somebody sued them because they were like, hey, just because I can't see doesn't mean I shouldn't be able to shop at your store. Yeah.
If I could interrupt for
Please, yeah.
So the ARIA labels is something that I hadn't heard before, but it's actually quite common when you're doing UI testing on Apple mobile apps and iOS.
Mm-hmm.
Their recommended approach is actually you should have all the accessibility labels filled in.
Yes.
Because that also aids your UI testing.
Well, and here's the interesting thing is I think when you're using it for testing, that's not going to necessarily be the description that you want for the user, right?
And their stance is if you do it for accessibility, the payback is it makes your testing easier for doing it because you have them. because, you know, and I'm wondering if that approach,
I've seen it. It works better than the concept of trying to use like grab me the first H1 on the page, definitely. And it works better than using CSS classes, which is another really common one. But I still think like we wouldn't do that with the text inside of the header, right? Like that would change. And I think that's what the ARIA label is for people who can't see, right? Like that should be user facing,
Okay.
and it should be subject to change, and it should be something we're thinking about. So I have an alternative, which I recently came across and I quite like, which is using data attributes. So HTML supports this concept of just adding any data attribute you want, and it's meant to be interacted with JS. What's interesting about using those is, so for one, you know that it's not going to be touched by any other part of your app, so it's safe and it's removed. You're also not getting in the way of being like as accessible as you can be. Sorry, I'm going to make this full screen. And then the other interesting thing is if you really wanted to, if you're using something like Webpack or your deployment tooling, you could strip all that out.
Yeah.
Because if you're just using data-test, you know that that's universally always going to be your test stuff. You never need it. You can always pull it out. So I recently...
So of course you get the developer that puts something in based on that data label.
Yeah.
And that's why you have a
Well,
CI server.
hopefully you have a test protecting yourself against that.
Exactly. What? Oh my god.
Yeah, so this one I've definitely heard before. The ARIA labels thing is like the best practice, and that's what you should do. I've changed my tune on this. I think like a couple years ago I would have been definitely on the same page. And honestly, it's still probably better than a lot of the other options, like using your CSS classes or whatever else. Cool. The last thing I want to talk about really quickly, just because we've talked about Jest quite a bit, is Enzyme. So Enzyme is kind of the one thing that you might import with Jest. It is specifically for React rendering, and it is really awesome. So let's see if we have an example. So they provide two different kind of interfaces. So there's shallow rendering and full DOM rendering. So what you can do is instead of rendering your whole app, so this is all for front end and specifically React testing, what you can do is render your component in a vacuum, sort of, which is awesome because it makes it super fast, super performant. You can test just the inputs to that component. And it actually gets you around a lot of these problems that we were just talking about with ARIA labels, trying to find things in the DOM. You don't have to worry about that because you can just use your component name from React, render it, and then test it, which is great. Yeah, so for unit testing your components, you probably want to be doing shallow rendering. And then they also provide this acceptance testing interface with full DOM rendering. So this actually would be like, if I want to test that full walkthrough of my app, I can render the full DOM and interact with it using their API, and it is real sweet. For anybody who's done this on the Rails side using like Selenium and all the rest of it, it can be a real pain. I found that this made things really, really easy, which was cool.
But it only applies if you're using React?
Yes, unfortunately.
Yeah,
It's a library from Airbnb. Yeah. So that's all I got. I'm sorry. That was really brief.
No.
Does-
Questions, first of all, I'll kick them off.
Sure.
So one of the things that's always held me back with JavaScript testing was kind of like the overhead associated with it. Because,
Right.
you know, I wherever possible, and I really like when I do myself a continuous testing kind of environment. And it almost seems like JavaScript is, okay, now you do something and then you run all your end tests. And the test frameworks you seem to address some of that to some degree, although I haven't seen. But one of the things I was also wondering about, besides the kind of heaviness of the installs to go with these sorts of things, is also what about using light frameworks like Stimulus? If you had, like if you're doing the Stimulus approach, which is, you know, small bits of JavaScript in your application because most of it is HTML and CSS, how do any of these apply to something like that approach?
So I'm not familiar with stimulus, but I can say from these JavaScript frameworks, Jest is surprisingly lightweight for the amount it does,
Okay.
and it can run those really small unit test kind of things. You can run it, interestingly, like against Node, like your backend, you can use Jest, also against your front end. I've found that like it's very, very quick. It's like multi-threaded by design, so you can run like, if you have like a big 8-core machine, your tests are going real quick, which is super cool. Mocha is, I think, even lighter weight, so it is super, super small. So yeah, I think it depends on your use case, I guess. I don't know if that actually answered your question at all.
No, I tried installing
Excuse me.
Jasmine in the past, but there was like this step to kind of get over, to get everything configured and running together and then
Right.
get the things, and
So-
it seemed to be counterproductive. Like, do I want to invest the amount of time, which is not necessarily a good approach to take, because often there's,
Yeah.
a step up no matter what approach you're taking.
Yeah.
But I was just wondering if, that was one of the things that helped me back with that.
So a couple more comments I could make on that quickly. So for one, the tools have come so far,
Yeah.
and not just like these are testing frameworks that are agnostic to the kind of testing you're doing and stuff like that. But speaking of the overhead of tests, a lot of it was setting up like Phantom.js, if anybody remembers using that,
Yeah,
which is
yeah.
now gone. So now there's like headless Chrome, which is amazing, and it's super simple to use, super well supported. It's the only one everybody's using, so there's lots of like documentation and stuff online. So all of those tools have just come so far, and they are faster, they're quicker, they're smaller, which is really cool. The other thing that I'll say that's interesting is I think TypeScript has made a huge impact in terms of making your JavaScript more testable and being able to do those itsy bitsy little tests, because you can just, with TypeScript and even like ES6 classes, you can just test your class. You don't have to be trying to run your whole app or do a crazy, run all of your JavaScript to be able to test this much of it. You don't have to do that anymore. You can test your class, you can test its functions.
Yeah, that was one of the things that, when you're running tests and you're running them continually as you're doing development, really what you're focusing on is testing small little chunks.
That's right, yeah.
And then if things go well with whatever it is that you're focused on, then you want it to run at least maybe not the full suite, right? Like if you're doing back-end calls and stuff like that for your full acceptance,
Yeah.
or whatever name you want to call that. But you're doing all of your unit tests, right?
Yeah.
I do this piece and that works, and I do all my unit tests.
Yeah,
I do
that's
this
right.
piece, that works, and all my unit
Yeah,
tests. That's
and if you look back to like the CoffeeScript Rails world of like 5 years ago, I feel like that kind of testing would have been all but impossible.
Well,
Yeah.
it was difficult, which was, I
Yeah.
think,
So
one
the,
of the problems with my own adoption of it.
yeah, and I
That and a thick hand.
I will say too that Rails does complicate a bunch of this itself, because the problem with Rails is it's doing everything for you, and it's so big, so it is a little tricky to kind of like, if you have a separate Rails API and a separate front end, it's really easy to test your front end. If you're running the whole thing together, although there's other issues with that too. Sorry. Any other questions?
Andrew, we're other side.
So, I thought most of these use Node.js to run tests, but you mentioned headless Chrome. Do they all run in headless Chrome?
No, they don't. Not.
Repeat it for the
Oh, sorry. The question was, all of these frameworks run using Node. I mentioned headless Chrome. Do they all run in headless Chrome? That is a really good question. I'm actually not sure by default whether they can all do that. I'm fairly certain that Jest is using headless Chrome to be able to get the snapshots that I talked about. So it has like the visual comparison of what your page looked like before and what it looks like after. I'm fairly certain it's using headless Chrome for that. Mocha and Jasmine, I'm just not sure. For Enzyme, 100% for sure they're using headless Chrome.
They can probably all be configured to use headless Chrome.
Yeah, and in reality, for a bunch of them, you probably don't want to. So like if I'm testing a Node app as an example, I don't want to be using headless Chrome. There's just no reason to. I'd rather.
Yeah, my worry is I'm gonna write some code to make it share between back end and front end, and I'm gonna depend on some Node.js specific feature, and then it doesn't work in Firefox.
Right. Yeah, I don't think any of them would be importing kind of like Node APIs into their own like test suite kind of thing. So you should be okay in that regard.
If you're doing that, that'd be kind of scary because then you can't rely on your tests that you've written because they're running in a potentially completely different environment.
That's right. Yeah.
Sorry for my ignorant question, but
Don't be.
so if the JS testing is it testing for the entire system that includes HTML tags, JavaScript codes, Ruby on Rails and everything?
Yes. Okay. So the question was, are these testing everything, your whole system? The answer is it depends what kind of test you're writing. So like I said, with showing you the full DOM rendering in Enzyme, what we're testing here would be like an actual rendering of your app. If you have backend calls within that to like a mock server or something, you'd be testing that kind of stuff as well. But you could use Jest just to test an individual function in your Node API on the back end, right? So it depends. They're very flexible frameworks, much the same way like if you think of R-Spec, R-Spec does view testing, so you can test your HTML and your CSS using R-Spec, but it doesn't mean you have to. You can also be testing a little function on one of your classes. It's the same thing, yeah.
But it doesn't really tell you those outputs, what your output would be, right? You know what I mean? Like, for example, if I run my app and see like a form,
Mm-hmm.
so but within that form, there might be an error.
Mm-hmm.
Instead of addition, there might be minus.
Right.
So that's a logical error, right?
Mm-hmm.
So how could this kind of figure out that?
So yeah, like I said, what you would do in that case, in the case of a form, you could test it at a couple levels. So you could unit test. Let's pop back to this for 1 second. So, so there's the different levels of testing, right? So a unit test is that lowest level. So you might actually have tests on your form that would say, when I fill out these two fields, make sure that they get added. And that would be kind of a unit test that's just your form. Now, if we want to talk about testing your whole system, so let's say the addition isn't happening on the front end. So on the front end, I just fill out this form, I hit save, it sends to my server, my server does the addition. So what I might want to do in that case, I could have a mock server, or maybe if your test is actually hitting your API, which is probably a bad thing to do, but you could do that. And that would be closer to that kind of acceptance test that we were talking about. So it would test that you render your whole app, you have like an automated like robot user that's punching into that form, fills in both fields, hits save, that reaches out and talks to your server or your mock server, you get your response back, and then that would be what you would test there. And that would be kind of at that acceptance level test. So I guess to answer the original question, the answer is yes, you can test your whole system. For most tests, you shouldn't be. I'm going to pull something up really quickly.
So there is a whole philosophy surrounding how you approach testing in the different levels.
Yeah.
And when it's appropriate to do what and where. And, you know, there are various things that also go into setting up your tests, right? So when you're doing unit testing, you essentially want these to be very small, discrete chunks. Another point about unit testing is good unit tests are independent and they're fast, so that they can run, right? The faster you can run your unit tests, the more likely the developer is to run all the unit tests, right? So if you have a unit test suite that takes 30 minutes to run, your developers are only going to run them once a day or twice a day.
Mm-hmm.
Whereas if they take, you know, 60 seconds, they're going to be running them very often, if not all the time. You know, and if you're talking sub-minute, then they'll run them almost with possibly file changes, right? Which is one of the things that you're getting to. So there's ways that you achieve that, but integration then testing then makes it bigger,
Yeah.
so that you start adding these components together. So the unit testing, you want to test just the one thing. So think of it like a car. You're testing the spark plug. Are the threads the right way? Are the threads the right diameter? You know, are they the right pitch? Are they all the right things that you need to put the spark plug? So you're just testing the spark plug. You're not testing the engine. You can test the engine, which tells you, yes, the spark plugs work, right? But you want to make sure all the spark plugs are good before you put them into the engine. And then, you know, and so you build up the testing. And that's the different layers: integration, system, and acceptance.
Yeah.
See, that's a very, very good example. I want to add on that actually. So let's say the analogy of a car. Let's say you have a used car, right? I want to buy a used car, so I take it to the inspectors. I pay like $70 or whatever. They run through the entire system, right? They test it. So what happens if I just give you an app that's never been tested before? And then what do you do with that?
I turn down the contract and move along. No, I'm just I'm just kidding. There's
A good way of evaluating whether or not you should take a contract for some code is sometimes looking at the tests and what their coverage is.
I was just kidding. There is a serious answer to that. I think there's a really great book called Working with Legacy Code, and the way that the person who wrote that lays it out is what they would do. Let's say you wanted me to add to your app. You probably aren't hiring me just to test it. You want me to add to it, make a new feature, whatever. The first thing you should actually do is lay down those tests, because that's going to make sure if I add something on that I'm not breaking everything else. Because that's the scary part about software development, is things are so interlinked that I can make a change on this page or in this controller that I don't think should impact anything else, and all of a sudden I break people logging in. People can't log in, and it's like, well, how did that happen?
That's one of the good things about unit tests and having a good unit test suite with good coverage, is that I mean, even when you're working alone, you'll protect yourself from yourself.
Yeah.
Because you'll change something and something will break and you go, oh wait, oh yeah, I can't change it that way because this is dependent. You know, those things, they start to pile up so that you can see that. As a real life example, I took over work on a framework that was doing a SOAP interface for some health data, and it was not very well tested, right? And so I could do something, and I found out that they had made some poor assumptions in a piece that they were doing that was going to require fairly hefty rewrite of this one section that simply had no tests. So I then, first of all, what I had to do was take what it did, as it was, you know, basically working for what it did, write tests around that, and then re-architect it, refactor it, so that it was then would work with the changes that I had to make sure that the tests kept running.
Yeah, so those are the kind of the steps for working with legacy code from the book, almost to the letter. It's you add tests, then you refactor, so you change it so that it's clean and modern, and then you add stuff, and it should work. The other thing that I think Andy kind of touched on, which is a good point, is unit tests are so valuable while you're working, because they give you that insight, not that, hey, this system is broken, I shouldn't ship it. It's not about like, oh, I shouldn't put this in front of the users. It's about, oh, I made a mistake while I'm coding. This is the exact mistake I made, and here is exactly how I can fix it. If you're writing good unit tests, it feels like that, where even like the people who are a bit more junior here have probably experienced like when you get a really good error back that it's like, you sent one argument, I expected two. So having those unit tests, that speeds you up so much as you're working. The acceptance tests are more of that level where you're trying to keep it out of the user's hands. So this is, as far as I can tell, all my code is working, but it's breaking when I'm trying to actually use it.
The acceptance test, going back to the car analogy, is the test drive.
Oh, okay.
That's right, yeah.
Okay, you get in it, you take it out on the highway, you do 10 minutes on the highway, right? You see how it handles in the rough road, you see how it handles, you know.
Hopefully the wheels don't fall.
Yeah, that's right.
And then you go back to the dealership after spending your 45 minutes in the car. that's the level of what it is, right? The sort of idea, right? So,
And it- And I think the point of this pyramid here is kind of like you should have thousands of unit tests, let's say, or a ratio of kind of 10 to 1 at least, probably a lot more than that, closer to like 100 to 1 of unit tests, those little itsy bitsy ones that tell you that every little bit is working, to the acceptance test. That acceptance test, like, the thing is, you can almost get away without automating it. If you're working on your app, how much does it cost you if you finish a feature to go in and make sure it actually works in your browser? You might do that like once a day, once a week even. If it's like a big feature, I still think you should write them because I'm a developer and I love automating things, but yeah.
So another thing that comes up is when you have the discussions about strongly typed versus weakly typed languages, one of the initial things that a lot of people said when in defense of Ruby as a weakly typed language was you should be writing tests anyways. So a lot of the people that from the strongly typed camp would suggest that the strong typing makes your code better such that you may not need to test at a level. And those of us in the weakly typed camp, which, because I believe that weakly type is still valid, right? I like both of them. But also coming from a strong testing, I believe in testing very much, I think you need to be doing testing anyways, because, just because it compiles doesn't mean your code works. And there's a fallacy in some of the strongly typed people that, oh, no, because it compiles, it's better. No, it compiles.
So, so just for the people who might not know, a weakly typed language like Ruby, you don't have, the code doesn't compile, so you don't have this extra step in between. With a strongly typed language, you have a step in between that kind of checks that you passed in the right kind of variables to your arguments. Your classes are like shaped the way you expect them to be. So it almost is a bit like testing, which is interesting, and I think there is like maybe something to that.
There's a little bit of it. I mean,
Yeah.
But there's other. It's a nuanced discussion. But at the heart of it, what I really want to say is that unit tests have provided a lot of the functionality that people thought. Well, if it's weakly typed, then you're going to be missing that. And if you're writing unit tests anyways, you are getting a lot of that to begin with.
That's true, yeah.
So.
Any other questions? Hello, Will.
If you're just starting to test your front ends on your applications, what's a good resource you would suggest for learning how to write good, like, jest tests or Mocha tests, for example?
Okay, I have a really good, the question was, are there resources for learning to test the front end? I have the best thing for R-Spec, I mention it like to somebody once a day, is this better specs thing. This is not for your front end, it's for the back end, so I'm not answering the question, I'm sorry. but I think the simple answer is RTFM. Jest has very good documentation, so I'd suggest you read it before giving it a shot. I don't have a really good example. I would say maybe Google it. I'm sorry. Yeah, but I do. Better Specs is amazing. It's if you just follow the stuff they have written here, you'll write really, really good R-Spec tests, if that's what you're testing in.
And seconding the read the manual, because R-Spec has some excellent documentation around it.
Mm-hmm.
I'm presuming that Just is very similar to that as well, where the documentation not only tells you what it will do, how it works, but it will give you examples as well.
Yeah, the Relish app site, which is not the official documentation, people will sometimes point out very strongly.
Oh, I didn't know that. I thought it was. I always use it.
It's not. And some people will say there are places where it's incorrect, but I still go to the Relish to look at how things are done because there's examples. The Relish site is actually done using R-Spec to produce the Relish site. So the examples are actually running to produce, to show you, right? So they use it to do itself. So they use R-Spec to test all the things that they're trying to show you. It's meta. but it can be handy if you're looking at how to do things. Another thing that people that are new to writing tests often fall into is you need to be careful. There's probably an art to writing tests that comes, the more tests you write, the better you become at it, I would suggest, which implies that it's an art. People might argue with that, but at any rate, the first thing to realize is you shouldn't test things that are probably tested elsewhere.
Yep.
Don't test that Postgres saves records in the database.
Don't test your language.
Yeah.
You don't need to confirm that,
That
for
for
example,
loop
Ruby's
works.
.2i will turn it into an integer.
Yeah, right. So understanding that things, that if you're using a framework, the framework should be testing those things that the framework provides, or you shouldn't be using the framework. Looking at the test for a framework is a good thing to do. Making sure the tests are running and choosing a framework is actually one of the things that go towards choosing a good framework, but then don't test it, right? Don't test that active record converts things into simple.
Test your code, not
Yeah.
the other people's
Test the
code.
things that you're doing, right? And that applies all the way up and down the line into, all the way up to your acceptance tests too, right? So.
Yep.
I use both R-Spec and unit test, and so far my only testing of JavaScript has been through Selenium and Capybara.
Yeah.
And I'd really like to start unit testing, but so I was wondering, is there a gem that plugs into a Rails project that lets you set up some JS tests and, in your /test directory or something nice like that, where you just write a rake test or Rails test or rake spec or whatever, and it just runs your JavaScript unit test through?
I would bet. I'm betting that there's a jest gem. There's I don't know if you've seen those gems, but there's so many gems where it's like an NPM package that's just wrapped in a gem. And it just does kind of the import stuff for you.
Jasmine had a gem.
Yep.
Yes, it does. That's
I don't
right.
know how well it worked.
Is that the right way to go these days, or would you just node something? I'm not really an expert at nodes.
I think Rails went the Yarn route. What I've been doing lately with Rails apps is fully extracting my backend and having a separate front-end app. So having a Rails API that is in Rails API only mode, and then your front end is over here and it's easy to test. It does add overhead, and you have a separate repo and all of that jazz, which you might not like. And you lose a bunch of the Rails front-end tools if you're into those. Personally, I think they're a bit out of date. I'm kind of praying for the day that Rails just admits that kind of the Vue stuff is done for and brings in React or something else and just makes that integration really seamless. But yeah, so Rails is working with Yarn these days, I think, really well. So I would suggest just using Yarn and pulling in Jest or something like it. There are, like I said, probably a million options. I really like Jest. I think it's great. If you're used to R-Spec, it's pretty familiar, and you don't have to think about. One of my pet peeves with JavaScript is you have 30,000 modules to solve one problem, but you need all of them and they all work together. I really don't like that. I like the old Rails world where it's Rails solves all my problems and I don't have to think about it, and there's a Rails way of doing it. And I think Jest is pretty close to that. You won't have to import sign-on. You might, if you have to do really fancy stuff with time zones, you might have to import another package or two, but it's not too bad. Anybody else? I have one plug I want to make before I go and sit down. It's somewhere here. Polyglot. This is a conference that's happened in Edmonton the last year and then 3 years ago. So the premise of it is it's an unconference, so anybody can show up and talk as long as they get enough votes. It's a really, really fun event. There's Last year, I think we had 3 separate tracks, so there's lots of different options for talks to do at any given time that suit your level, whatever that might be, or your interests. We're planning for doing it sometime in February. We'll see if that happens. I'll post in the Slack group if any of you are interested.
Oh yeah, please.
Yeah.
Post. I think it's fine to post anything, as far as I know, from the start of Edmonton. So all sorts of people post things in there. So
This is
local conferences, particularly like that, you may want to post in and outs as well.
Yeah.
Can you describe what an unconference is?
Yeah, sorry. Okay, so the premise of an unconference is you show up in the morning, there's gonna be some snacks and stuff. Anybody who wants to do a talk or a session or has a request for a session can write it down on a piece of paper, stick it to the wall, and then we all do dot voting. So if my thing is I'm super interested in Rails, I can put all of my stickers on the Rails stuff. Whichever is the most popular, those will all get chosen. And then you'll have kind of 3 tracks throughout the day, probably 4 or 5 sessions. You go to them all, you have lunch, you hang out with other developers and people who are interested in tech stuff in Edmonton. It's a really good time. I know last year,
Where will it be? Do you know?
we don't know yet, but they asked me to plug it, even though we have no details. That is not the correct date. This is last year's.
Oh,
But they did ask me to like pump it up to you guys, so it's coming to TBD on all of the details.
Update the site so it just says TBD.
Yeah, I probably
So
will do
what did
that.
you guys talk about last year?
Oh, one of my favorite sessions was, one of them was on hiring and the different practices people are using, and it was so interesting because there's a blend of people who are applying for jobs, but also people who are hiring and talking about their different experiences. That was really cool. There was a big one on cross-platform development on mobile, which I think is a really interesting topic these days. There's a lot of tools out there, and all of them seem bad in different ways. So that was a lot of fun. There was one on health as a developer. So there's a local guy who happens to be kind of an expert on this stuff. So he broke down like what he's done to like get super healthy as a developer. It's kind of challenging to stay healthy as a dev because you spend a lot of time sitting. Yeah. Sorry?
And being angry.
Yes, that's right. Yeah, that's not healthy. Also, all the meetups have pizza except for this one. Good job, guys. So that, yeah, gotta watch your health.
that's a funding thing, not a health thing.
Okay.
We just piggyback on their sandwiches.
Anyway, I'm sure one of us will be back to plug this again once we have a date. But yeah, it's a lot of
By all
fun.
means, yeah.
There's also,
If you want, when we, like, for instance, in January, when we have our meetup in January, just let us know and we'll put it on the announcements.
cool, thank you, yeah. And just an FYI, they do have one of these in Calgary that runs usually in like June, and they have one in Vancouver as well. So if you're in one of those cities, or if you like to travel, they're worth going to. It's super fun. Okay, I will leave now.
Awesome, great talk.
Thank you.